when you started in photography, you didn't know any more about it than anyone else. You didn't know how to develop film or how to print. So how did you learn?
I learned by reading a lot of books when I was in the Army. I read every book that was in the library and found, much to my dismay, that there really was no processing. Was a piece of cake. You just simply shot it, you process it for time development, end of story. What really intrigued me was the ability to make really fabulous prints. And there I found myself at a quandary, because every photographer, from Ansel Adams down to Feininger to everyone that claimed expertise in the darkroom, was actually talking about how they would print. And if you applied the technique to their specific image, paper, temperature, time, it would work. But I didn't have access to Ansel Adams' negatives at that time. I still don't. I had my negatives, clients' negatives, okay? And I discovered, much to my dismay, that this is a haphazard process of taking a print, throwing it in the enlarger, exposing it for a certain amount of time, putting it in the developer, and winding up with a target, so to speak. I mean, that's what it is still to this day. And I said, there's got to be a better way. And I went to bed thinking about this, and one night I got up and I came up with this f-stop method of printing. This method where you distinguish exposures in terms of f-stops, not time. It's based on time, so if you had a 5-second exposure, one f-stop more would be 10, one f-stop more is 20, 40, so you had 5, 10, 20, 40. And I was on that premise. Then having an engineering background, the 5, 10, 20, 40, for me, I recognized that as an exponential progression. Then I was able to actually calculate the numbers in between, the quarter stops. And I came up with this f-stop method. So I teach it now, various, when I go out and do my lectures on darkroom processes. So the exposure you make is 5 seconds, like on this image, and then you cover it, then you expose for a further 5 seconds, exposing that for a total of 10, cover that, expose for a further 20, so you have a basic exposure 5, 10, 20, 40, and then if you're lucky, you would hit on one of them, and you'd say, oh good. So that made sense to me, that you could actually, with the first piece of paper, you could actually create this, rather than this arbitrary exposure time, and you don't know where you are. So this 5, 10, 20, 40 seconds, if I got lucky and somewhere between 10 and 20, then I would look at my chart in which I developed and say, should it be slightly darker than 10 or slightly lighter than 20? Or can it be possibly in between? And I knew that value. 14.1 is something in between, okay? This is halfway, exposure-wise, between 10 and 20 was 14.1. Quarter of a stop less is 16.8. A quarter stop darker is 11.9. Exponential progression. Really simple. You don't have to memorize it. You just have a chart. Then the government of England, how amazing is this? I didn't know about this. My bank manager called up. And then, of course, I practiced this technique, and it was working. Basically, I could take 2 sheets of paper, and I'd pretty much be damn it near it, okay? Third sheet was nailed, so all these things are like maybe 3 sheets of paper. My bank manager called me up and said, hey, Gene, we got a program here that I think you might be interested in. So what is it? We're giving away money. I said, oh, that's very nice. What do I need to qualify? He says, well, you've been talking to me about this invention of yours. And I had created this invention, which was the Nocon photographic timer, which broke up the time in f-stop values so that you didn't have to use this calculator or anything. You just simply did it, and it worked. He took me out to lunch and said, how much money do you need? I said, how much can I take out? I said, I'll take it all. So he hands me all this money, and I use it to buy myself a brand new car. No, I didn't. I redeveloped this thing. I hired a company in the north of England, which was impoverished at the time, and I had their owner come down and see me, and I showed him what I was doing, and I said, all this money I've been given is going to go to you. You're going to have it. Make this for me, and we'll distribute it. And we did. So we made initial 1,000 units or 100 units, and then we got Calumet to start producing it for us. So we made a ton of these things. I didn't get rich in the process, but what it did was to make it possible for schools like I later find out that schools such as the Art Institute of up in LA and San Francisco, Pasadena, and all these schools actually have these timers, and they make it available to kids who know this process, and they become instant printers. I am delighted to say that if my contribution to the industry has been to provide them a means or method to actually do something properly like this, it also opened up the possibility of other techniques which had been, up until now, not possible. It was like, for me, I make the analogy of like creating a wheel. Now, the wheel started out maybe as something that kids could roll down the hill. But in the process of creating this Nocon timer, I rediscovered, because I didn't discover it originally, the technique of flashing. You know that technique? Where you pre-expose the paper to a certain amount of light, short of actually fogging the paper. So why is this important? Because one day, my secretary picks up the phone and she says, "Yes, he's here. Who's speaking?" And and I'm sitting at my desk and says, "Gene, it's someone named Yosef Karsh." No kidding, Yosef Karsh. So, well, I recognized the name because, of course, I knew who he was. But even better was the fact that I met him the night before at an exhibition. And we got to talking, and apparently he called me up. He says, "Gene, I'm looking at these pictures that I understand you printed for Cecil Beaton, my dear colleague." And I said, "Yeah, I printed those." "Tell me," he says, this is the conversation of sorts. He said, "Tell me, what kind of paper are you using?" I said, "Agford Record Rapid." "I use that paper, but I don't get this shadows and highlight detail that you're getting. Do you suppose they're sending me bad batches of paper?" I said,
"Do you suppose you could show me how to do this trick?"
And he did. I showed him the flashing technique. And so there goes, I think, the best lesson I can tell anyone, that no matter how much you know about photography, how well established you are in the community of photography, that there are still things that will, in the likes of people like Karsh and Parkinson and everyone else that ever worked for, they're still thirsting for any knowledge they can get into. And so when I told him about the flashing technique, which he hadn't done, he said, "I want to send my printer down to you. Can you show him how?" And I showed him how. And whether he's employed that or not doesn't matter. The fact that such a man as Mr. Karsh should call up, a darkroom dude, find out what's going on, tells me that there's a lot of people out there with a few lessons to learn about how to coax it's already been learned, but we've forgotten it because of the processes we go through now with multi-grade papers, which you can never do flashing anymore. When graded papers came out, you could still flash it, but before there was graded papers, you had to know how to flash. That's the history of our industry. That as we, if you look at any of the vintage prints from those done many years before, the quality of which was incredible. You saw detailed shadows, highlights, and everything. That's because the dudes that practice it were the practitioners of our craft. Those who are learning how to do it by using such things as multi-graded papers have no knowledge of what this guy was doing, because he thinks he doesn't need it anymore. And I think by bringing that out, even with multi-grade, I can no longer flash because of multi-grade. I was flashing because of graded, and I could flash before the graded papers. But because these things are no longer available to you, this is dead in the water, and kids aren't learning this. Which brings me to where we are today, the digital world, which is a lot of people are kind of, shall we say, backing off on it. But
backing off meaning, what do you mean?
There's hesitation on their acceptance of this use of, and I would tend to agree that the quality of the silver-based prints can't be faulted, because this is the standard by which we see how black and white is to be, and that in the industry of digital, we can do it, but the final product is always the print. In our industry, photography, this is the end product. Neither the equipment, the cameras, the techniques, none of that stuff matters. If you can't produce a print, I mean, you can't call yourself a photographer. I mean, or find someone that can produce this, a print. And if the print is of such quality as to be questioned, then it is, you know, we don't have it anymore. I'm really glad that such companies as the one that you represent still exist. I work for Freestyle as their advisor, and I straddle the two disciplines, both digital and the traditional black and white. I advocate the fact that the schools should continue with the learning process, that they should continue to provide our schools with paper and the chemicals, because truly it is in the darkroom that photography can be learned. The very fact of taking pictures is not really photography, not just capturing an image, and that can be said as well of digital. Now here's where the separation takes place. Taking the picture, be using a digital camera or a traditional camera, is one and the same. It's still, you know, personal vision. But now you come into the darkroom, and if he or if the student is a practitioner of the darkroom techniques, they learn how to manipulate the image, because truly it is the manipulation of the image. And how much manipulation do you give it? As much as you can possibly give it, without causing, you know, distortion or images that are there. The very fact, I mean, this issue crops up a lot. Because of my work in digital now, I can be very clever about it. I can take a photograph and manipulate it till the cows come home. And I intend to. I intend to, because that is the nature of photography. To create images in the way that I see it, not necessarily what it is. If what it is what it is, then forget photography. The very fact that you point a camera in this direction is a manipulation of the image, okay? And the fact that you light it differently is a manipulation image. There is no image that I know of that hasn't been manipulated. Every print I've ever put my hands on has been manipulated to some degree, either through tonal values, through cropping, through any number of things. Now I've opened up, I call that the darkroom, whereas the darkroom was a pathway to a little path that helped me look at, you know, I walk down this small path, this narrow path, and I can make some changes to where I'm walking. The digital world is like a highway. It's absolutely, it's wide and expansive, and you can move yourself very quickly into areas that have never been seen before. And that truly is what, it may not be defined as photography, I mean, because Mr. Parkinson, Norman Parkinson, defined it rather succinctly for me when I was doing his prints. He said, "Gene, photography is the study of light." And all my prints have to have this luminance, this quality of light, which was not inherent yet in my work. And after kind of tearing prints in front of me, I would do this print and he would tear it in front of me. I was like, whoa.
Well, let's pull out the one here by Cecil Beaton.
Can you focus on it then?
Yeah, if you'll just put it right up there, and then I'll go ahead and take a photograph of it.
There's this print by Cecil Beaton. It's a classic image, and I was responsible for printing this, if I can keep that there.
Move that over about 3 inches.
Is that good?
That takes it out. You see that
branch?
Yeah. Thank you.
All right. So that's, and this is a very good example. This picture called The Debutantes by Cecil Beaton. This is a very good example of what digital can do today. This is not a digital image. This is silver. But I've since scanned this, and I want to scan the original negative. And this is what I was telling you over the telephone. I think inherently the equipment we use today, the digital world, enables us to make changes to the image that had been up till now impossible to do. For instance, in a case such as this, all these highlights, there's still detail in there, okay? in the shadow areas. There's still detail in there for which I could not pull out.
Would you run your finger over that again?
Well, here's the highlights here, which I could burn in a bit. Okay, there's highlights up here, albeit very little, but it's still there. There's when. Oh, I'll get on the computer and I'll show you how I made such changes to this as to create an image that I believe that Cecil Beaton would have approved. One of the things that I'm hope to do, and for a client of mine, is to go back to the original negatives, certainly the ones that I printed, and rescan the negatives. And as I was responsible for printing it in the first place, I have a very intimate knowledge of how this was printed, when I printed, when the guys were alive. So I'm the only person that can qualify how this print should be or could be done. In the past, they'd always give me carte blanche. Whatever I chose to print and how I chose to print it became the de facto standard. It was that, because there was no other way to compare it to. Sure, they could have taken to another printer and he would print it differently, but as far as they were concerned, this was the be-all, end-all of this was the end of the line. If I had said to them at the time, listen, we now have a piece of equipment that'll make a vast improvement on this, do you think they would have said no? Of course not. They would have said, Gene, do what you need to do. Was it chemical? No. Is it magic voodoo? I said, yeah. Then do it. No one would have denied me that. No more so than my saying this needs to be dodged, this needs to be cropped. They were
just make it better.
That was the whole thing. How'd you know that?
That would be the standard, wouldn't it?
That's the mantra. That is the mantra of darkroom work.
Now let's go back to this photograph and explain to me a little bit about the history of the photographs.
The history, it was taken by Sir Cecil Beaton. Some of you may not know the name. It was, I don't remember who the designers were, but he had gathered these women together, and these are ball gowns that he set up in a room, I don't know where, the Savoy perhaps, and he just posed them. There was hot lights in here, as you can see, and he lit up the place just the way it was. It was an 8x10 negative. So you can imagine, you know, the process of putting this in my 8x10 and larger, and then seeing this thing up there. And when I first produced it, it was it was there. Believe it or not, it would have had to use a very soft grade of paper, like grade 1. I won't go much lower than that. And I did flash it. But even the flashing wasn't even going to give me the detail in there. And there wasn't sufficient time, nor the masking. And when I say time, I mean the exposure time, to burn that in without graying it. Today, of course, with the digital imagery, I can change all. I can even change the perspective and not lose it. I mean, the finished product of this particular picture is just so amazingly beautiful that I wish Sir Cecil Beaton were still alive today, and he would cry if he saw it. I'm aware of this because there was a gentleman named Paul Tanqueray who came to see me. He was 90 years old at the time he came to see me, and that was 20 years ago. So I imagine he's not upright anymore. But he came to me from the National Portrait Gallery, and the curator had come as well, Terence Pepper, and he very, very kind of progressively approached me as he entered my facilities in London, and he handed me this glass plate of Sir Cecil Beaton, and it's such an amazing picture. I have to draw attention to it because you wouldn't know it. So as he approached me, he said, "Can you make this print for me, please?" Here we are. Here it is. Here it is. The 3 generations of Sir Cecil Beaton. This is Sir Cecil Beaton in his younger days. Again, I printed that. I'm not sure who took this. It could have been Paul Tanqueray. Paul Tanqueray approached me with this negative, and I put it up for your viewing pleasure. When he approached me, I had no clue that a print had been made of it previously, and in the previous print, all this detail that you see here was missing. The printer, for some reason, decided to make it dark. when Paul Tankery came to visit me the following week, I presented him with this picture, and he looked at this and he was crying. He said, I had forgotten I had taken all those other pictures, and in the previous print it had been totally lost, focusing instead on the man's face. I just gingerly opened this up, and so, because I saw the images in there, and in the process of my techniques that I was using, I was able to open it up enough so that he could remember putting pictures all over him. No one knew why there was such arbitrary kind of things in there, but as a printer, the mantra, as you have just said, and I've heard, make it better. This is what Parkinson said to me. He would tear up the prints I'd done for him, and I'd say, make me look better. Make me the photographer that I am. And that onus, that responsibility was on me. And this is the last picture of him ever. And here he had just suffered a stroke. So this is Sir Cecil Beaton. So the job of creating these prints was all on me. Now, if the likes of these photographers, Norman Parkinson, for instance, and do you know the name? He was the doyen of fashion photography. People today who hear of his name just genuflect, basically, because he was the god of fashion, and I was his right-hand man, which was kind of cool. And it was for that reason that people, when they knew that I was printing for Norman Parks and the likes of Donovan, O'Neill, everyone and their mother would come and use me because they wanted the magic that I was creating for this guy.
And you're telling me that you're self-taught?
Yeah, because who would teach me? Oh, you know who taught me? These photographers who wanted me to make them better. They literally tore prints in front of me when it wasn't good enough. And that was my lesson. How could you teach that? How could anyone teach me how to print for Sir Cecil Beaton, Norman Parkinson, all these people?
Yeah, but who taught you to be good enough for them to come to you in the first place?
It was the process of flying together, of them knowing that I was very amenable to their thoughts and that I could interpret it, and that I had the means by which to design it, whether by my processes. I developed the Lith process, for instance. Do you know that process? We have this contest in England called the Ilford Photographic Contest, and it highlights the role of photographic printers, which I certainly advocate. I'd won it a couple times, the Grand Poobah title the year before, in 1980. I'd even helped Heather McCartney, Linda's daughter. She apprenticed under me, and over a period of months we got her to such a stage in her printing abilities that when she entered, she won the Junior Printer of the Year. She won, hands down. No one knew that it was her, save for the fact that I got a phone call from someone saying, Gene, is this anything to do with Linda? I said, as it happens. So that was a big publicity thing. Not only did we have a junior printer, we have the Amateur Printer of the Year. Okay, they started doing that. And one year, the Amateur Printer of the Year, the prize for that was 1 day with Gene Nocon, plus bits. Second prize was 2 days with Gene Nocon. That's a standard joke. But it was 1 day with Gene Nocon, spend time with Gene Nocon. This man turns up, Tim Rudman, and says hi, and I says, hello, how are you? And he spent the day with me, and where I taught him all the techniques, including the f-stop method of printing, which at that time he didn't feel he really needed, but now he advocates that process. And I said, this is a process now called Lith printing, where you take actual Lith paper, and this is my stand on it. Let me explain. Lith paper no longer exists. It's no longer there, okay? And without Lith paper, it can only be called the Lith process. Tim is very, very good at this stuff of using pseudo-Lith, meaning other papers that resemble the process. This I did for Barry Ladigan, and you can't believe the quality unless you have it. Look at this girl's face here. Okay, and if you have a macro lens, you could creep up on her face here, and you can see how sharp the acutance of this, the edge sharpness of this paper is such that it was used for doing black and white line prints, specifically black and white. By slowing down the development process for litho, there was a window of opportunity that enabled you to pull it, so to speak, and get the tonal values that was inherent with any photographic paper before it turns completely black and white. And that's the technique. You pull it when the tonal values come up. It's in my book. I wrote the book on litho printing. But without litho paper, this is impossible to do. So here's litho on Ilford's, that's on Kodak. This is litho on Ilford's paper. And up until this product was available, I was still doing litho because Kodak had stopped making it. I, of course, turned it into this one. This is a litho process. This won for me the title Printer of the Year in 1980. The process, the litho process, carries on, very simple process. You expose for highlights, develop for shadows, which is in direct reversal to processing film. You expose for shadows, develop for highlights. And that's just a wonderful teaching process. If I were going to teach photography today, it would be using litho paper, okay? Because truly, I mean, everything else is, our industry has shot themselves in the foot by trying to make things to accommodate the masses. They've made a very, very poor product. Had they left it well enough alone, then those of us who practice this would maybe be few and far between. But you'd get the best people in the world doing it. As it is, the masses created the product, which then those of us who practice this were left short of what we could do. It's like if we can create beautiful things, we'll interest the masses. And a few in the masses will learn this stuff. But if we don't have the product to make beautiful things, then the masses are no longer looking towards a leader and just saying, I'm bored with that. So they shot themselves in the foot. It's the way I think. You give them something beautiful to begin with, and the masses will follow because they want to do it. And half those masses will then continue. And it gets better and better because they're really getting good at this. They're all playing tennis, and they're all playing like, you know, what's his name, Tiger Woods, and they're all doing very well. And that is the process that causes people like me to continue this. If we find, if let's equate this to being a chef, if I've got the best products in the world and I'm cooking this stuff and everyone's coming to my restaurant like the Belgian Lion, it's really cool, all right? And so you get people enjoying the product of your labors. But if it all becomes mediocre, and people say, I don't want to know, because they haven't seen it anymore. And what's interesting is such companies as Ilford were listening to guys like me, to some extent. But they were being pulled in by the bigger companies like Kodak. But what's interesting about Ilford is that they're in England amongst those of us who practice this stuff. And when you ask, how'd you learn this? Well, that would then suggest there was someone who could really print the hell out of this stuff. And there was. His name was Michael Walden. So Michael is really unique in that the reason that we entered these contests was not because every year one of 6 of us would win. So it's like, okay, because we were good at it and we had the clientele to prove it. Michael, on the other hand, had no clients, but his job was to recreate the images that we submitted in our contest. Now, a number of us, Bill Rollinson, myself, maybe Larry Bartlett, I don't know about the other 3 guys, and I knew Robin Bell, they were really good printers. The object of the exercise was to flummox Michael Walden. Make him kind of like, how did these guys do this, print, okay? I knew I'd won this one year, when Michael called up and said, Gene, how'd you do that? What paper did you use? And then what chemicals did you use? And what dilution did you use? What exposure? So I figured, I got you. It wasn't because of, you know, prize. You get the prize, you shake hands, and all your buddies say, yeah, you won this year, I'll get it next year. It was to fool Michael Walden. Now, if anyone's going to be the grand poobah of printing, Michael was, because he could look at this print, save for the lift process, because that got him totally flummoxed. He didn't know what paper. He knew it was an Ilford paper, but had no clue what paper because he was trying all the papers. what was cool about Michael is we had to submit a 16 by 12, then he had to reproduce this as a 30 by 40.
He had to reproduce.
Oh yeah, because it was up on the wall, on display, and this gigantic print. Michael, you did it again. After telling Michael what paper and solution and everything else, because that was part of the process, he would produce it. But what was so cool about this thing is that I was forever inventing something so as to make my guys, and as well as my colleagues were making their guys, make them better. And the process encouraged good photography, good craftsmanship, good mechanics. And if you could do it methodically, that much more was, you were empowered, basically. And now when I teach kids the process, and oddly enough, our teachers are responsible for the lack of knowledge that these kids have. I have to say that because they don't pass it on. I stand on my soapbox and say, you teachers are responsible for this. So for that reason, I go and speak at the Society for Photographic Educators. Because if they're not teaching the kids anything other than they look at their pictures and they assess their photographs, the reality is they should be in the darkroom and showing them the techniques that make this possible. It's not how they point the camera. No one's entitled to pointing a camera. You point the camera where you like. I'll point where I like. Everyone points where they like. But the common denominator here is to get into the darkroom and be able to produce a product that is uniquely yours. Not only your vision, but the mechanics of putting it together. So I'm just happy to perpetuate the education of photography, which to this day I don't think has had any interest in the darkroom. They teach photography, but where is photography if not in the darkroom? And I pass on this rather interesting question: who invented photography? Not a photographer. The darkroom dude. The guy in the darkroom invented photography. Not the guy that's taking the pictures. It's those people who got in the darkroom and were able to actually put an image on paper. And that would be Daguerre, Niepce, or whoever, or Fox Talbot. They weren't in themselves defined as photographers. They were the technicians that were able to put an image down on paper.
Very quickly, what do you see for the future of photography now?
The future of photography hinges on our ability to look back at the history of photography and continue the education through the darkroom. Because digital photography is not photography. I can tell you that. That's not photography. It's digital imaging. Okay, but that's not photography. There's nothing in Photoshop that defines this thing as being a photographic process.